To start with, I would like to take a moment to speak about a curious phenomenon that has arisen over these past 16 months or so, and that is the dramatic rise in what we might call pandemic hobbies. These hobbies are not just limited to one or two generations, but seem to cross all lines and all economic statuses. For example, there's been the incredible popularity of Animal Crossing, a game on the Nintendo Switch, which involves world building and can be highly addictive, as I have seen in my own household. Baking has caught on as well. You would be hard-pressed not to find pictures of folks' starters and sourdoughs on social media, and I know many of you have commented on my wife's posts of all her amazing baking skills. Gardening has also taken off like a weed, pun intended. Home remodeling, if you could call that a hobby, has also caught on, leading to back orders of just about every appliance under the sun. Trust me, we had to order a new oven. A number of people have picked up a new instrument. Streaming, which was already popular and now has its own vernacular. All you have to say is a name like Tiger King or The Mandalorian, and folks know exactly what you're talking about. I too caught the hobby bug as well. Mine, however, started off with a piece of new technology and ultimately ended up with a piece of old technology. Before the pandemic, I picked up my first Apple Watch. The great thing about the Apple Watch is it is essentially an extension of your iPhone on your wrist. You can use it to track movement, check texts, keep an eye on your sleep cycle, set reminders, listen to music, get sports updates, and so much more. I especially enjoyed using mine for running, where I could leave everything but my headphones at home. It was great, but then reality began to set in. First off, this meant I was always connected. My wrist would vibrate at a text or a news update, often causing my wife to jump if I was sitting next to her on the couch. Secondly, it became harder and harder to update my watch. There was only so much memory, and I had to erase more and more apps and songs to create the space for simple updates. Eventually, I was no longer able to update this piece of technology. This, of course, is part of the idea, planned obsolescence. Eventually, you need to replace one piece of technology with another, often at greater and greater cost, both economically and environmentally. At this point, this is where my hobby picks up, I found myself exploring the world of mechanical watches. For the longest time, I would not even consider getting a mechanical watch. They are not nearly as accurate as quartz watches, and they require winding, or if they are movement-based, you have to wear them to keep them wound. I began to learn about the history and legacy of watchmaking. I saw all the debates on YouTube. I learned about Swiss watches, German watches, American watches, Japanese, Chinese, and so many more. I learned about the wide variety of movements along with the different manufacturers, but mostly I learned about the legacy and heritage of mechanical watches. They can cost anywhere from about $100 to hundreds of thousands of dollars. But what they all have in common is that if you take good care of yours, it can be an heirloom that can be passed down to the generations. And if you talk to someone who is wearing their parents' or their grandparents' watch, it quickly becomes a story more about the person than about the piece of timekeeping they have on their wrist. With all this in mind, I finally bit the bullet, traded in some of my quartz watches, and ultimately purchased my first mechanical watch, and I have not looked back. Going so-called old school has led me to think a lot about the meaning behind something so proven, so reliable, and so meaningful. In today's fast-paced world, where there is so much change and where it feels like everything is constantly in flux, I say it is nice to have something that I know I can rely on. It won't need an update. It won't need a battery, and if I treat it well, I'll be able to pass this heritage down to my children, and then they can pass it to theirs. But of course, at this point, we are no longer really talking about watches, but instead this beautiful tradition we have in our hands. Judaism is rich, deep, and varied, and contrary to some opinions, it covers all aspects of life. It is not just focused on the life of the soul or the matters of ritual. It is also focused on the life of the heart and the deeds of the hands. It has a little bit, but really a lot for each and every one of us. If you want to pray, we've got you covered. If you want to sing, we've got you covered. If you want community, we've got you covered. If you want bagels with a schmear, we've got you covered. If you want mysticism and enlightenment, we've got you covered. If you want to work with others to have a lasting impact on the world, to make it better, more welcoming, and more inclusive, we've got you covered. This is in part why there are so many different opinions when one asks a Jew a question. It is not that we are a contentious people, though we certainly can be. It is that there's no one way and no one right way to be Jewish. What is probably most important, though, is a fundamental right within Judaism, is the right to knowledge. Think about it. We start our Seders where the whole purpose is to get our children to ask questions so that we can teach them about our experiences, our heritage, and our traditions. This is why we are still here and have so much to offer the world. Like mechanical watches, there's something fundamental, something intricate to our heritage that has not only enabled us to survive, but also thrive even under the most challenging of circumstances. This is because the values of Judaism are not the values of the right or the left, of the conservative or of the liberal. They are the values of our people that have been both expressed and subsequently interpreted over thousands of years. They are the values that center the obligation of the individual towards the community over the rights of the individual. As a matter of fact, there is no expression of rights in Judaism. Instead, there are mitzvot, which are, in the words of my Jewish learning, the duties and responsibilities based on our love of God, where Jewish obedience to law and Jewish fulfillment of obligations are considered a form of divine worship. There's the Aramaic expression of kol havirim zeh bazeh. Each of us is responsible for one another. We have certainly expanded this notion during the pandemic that our actions impact not only ourselves, but others as well. This is probably why, in part, even though there is some vaccine hesitancy among certain sectors of the Jewish community, nearly 85% of American Jews, 85% are pro-vaccine. Kol havirim zeh bazeh. We are all responsible for one another. In our tradition, there are also the values that remind us of the obligation to take care of the earth entrusted to us by our Creator, as is found in the expression Bal Tashchit, do not destroy. In our region, this has become even more abundantly clear given the recent destruction wrought both by Hurricane Sandy in 2012 and the remnants of Hurricane Ida just a few days ago. If we do not find better ways to lessen our carbon impact, science tells us the earth will continue to impact us with greater ferocity. Bal tashchit, do not destroy. We were given the responsibility for taking care of this planet. We should constantly strive to be better stewards. There are also the values that can seemingly be contradictory but are focused on compassion. For example, the Torah presents numerous cases calling for the death penalty. But it is the rabbis who worked furiously to build a fence around the Torah so that it could almost never be enacted. It is the tradition that places reproduction at the heart of the Jewish endeavor. Peru urvu, be fruitful and multiply. But it also teaches us of the centrality of the mother's life, thus creating the foundation for the support for reproductive choice. We see this in Mishnah Ohalot 7:6, where it teaches us that the mother's life comes before the life of the fetus. Chayei komim lechayav, her life comes before that of the fetus, which I spoke about in great depth this past Shabbat. It is not that Judaism is pro-abortion. Rather, it recognizes the inherent complexity when discussing this profoundly difficult topic. Rather than provide simple answers, It begins with the notion that we have an obligation to start the conversation with the needs of the mother first, not the other way around. Our tradition is a tradition that teaches us over and over again about how we have an obligation to take care of the poor, the widow, the orphan, and especially the stranger in our midst. With regards to the stranger, we are commanded to take care of them no less than 36 times in the Torah, ahavat ger. You shall love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Clearly, as an itinerant, persecuted people, this value is utmost importance, ahavat ger, loving the stranger, for we were once outsiders, and it is our obligation to treat them as we wish to be treated, not with oppression, but instead with sustenance and support. Our tradition teaches us about the values of B'Tselem Elohim, how we are all created in the image of God. This includes all races, all gender identities, really all peoples. As Rabbi Arthur Green stated in his book, Seek My Face, we are created in the image of God, if you will, and we are obliged to return the favor. These are just a sampling of Judaism's eternal values, and there are so many more, some of which we will agree with and some of which we may disagree with. How we may choose to express those values as individuals is certainly up to us, but make no mistake, as a living, breathing tradition, Judaism has much to say on these topics. We should strive to be informed about what our tradition has to say. Sometimes what it has to say may make us angry and uncomfortable. Sometimes what it has to say make us feel heard and seen. And sometimes we will struggle with the multitude of ambiguities in our tradition, including the lack of egalitarian expression found in much of our heritage, which is an idea Reform Judaism has devoted itself to remaking by embracing not only egalitarian expression, but also through its full acceptance of inclusion of all. The question is, of course, what do we do with all of these values and ethics taught by our tradition? It is not merely enough to study them and to wrestle with them. Rather, our tradition is one of action. This is why the rabbis teach the study of Torah is equal to them all, because it leads to them all. Study and understanding is merely the first step, but more is required. The next step is to help realize these values in the world. And this is where tzedakah comes into play. Tzedakah is often translated to mean charity, but actually comes from the Hebrew word tzedek, meaning justice. Acts of tzedakah are the ways we can bring greater justice into the world. We can help reshape the world from the way it is into the way it ought to be. Yet we need not be overwhelmed. As Rabbi Tarfon taught in Pirkei Avot, you are not obliged to complete the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. To be Jewish means to live, express, and embody the values of our tradition. This is how we keep it alive, vibrant, relevant, and meaningful. Unlike watches, Judaism has not developed over centuries, but over several millennia. It has faced countless obstacles, including misunderstanding, hate, and persecution. Yet it has endured. It is as vibrant and meaningful today as it was over those thousands of years. Your presence, whether in person or virtual today, is a testament to that fact. Our tradition is not intended to be put aside for the rest of the year, but instead worn and used with pride. And if done so, like watches, with a little caretaking and a little maintenance, we can pass our heritage along to the next generation, who in turn will be able to wear it with pride as well, often thinking of the generations who have come before, as well as the ones yet to be. For we have but a finite period of time in our lives to live and embody the richness and depth of our heritage. And as we enter into this 5782, this new year, especially as the pandemic continues to wreak havoc, may we be reminded that Judaism is more than a hobby. It is a way of life. It is a way of life that can help us do better, be better, and have a more lasting and positive impact upon the world. Shana Tova.